Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. This is the second webinar in our Stand with Kashmir series that we are producing in partnership with Stand with Kashmir. My name is Uma, and I am the Executive Director of Women's March Global. Today, I am really excited to be able to host Faysal and Junaid. We are going to have a very in-depth discussion, and I want to just go over a little bit how the webinar is going to work. For all of those who are attending, thank you so much for joining us. You will see on the bottom of your Zoom screen, if you're not familiar with Zoom, a little box that says Q&A. And you can type in at any time any questions that you have or even any comments. I will see them during the course of the discussion, and we will leave a little bit of time for your questions and or to address your comments. I would like to remind everybody to be civil in your comments and your suggestions and your questions. The topic that we are talking about is not an easy one, but at the same time, we must be respectful in this space. And so please abide by those principles. Before we begin into this topic, I would like to have Junaid and Faysal just introduce themselves. So Junaid, if you can start first and introduce yourself, that would be great.
Thank you, Uma, so much. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Mohamad Junaid. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology at Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. I am a Kashmiri. I've written on Kashmir for years now. I've done extensive research on Kashmir. And my primary focus on research has been military occupation in Kashmir and the history of the Tehreek movement.
Great, thank you so much. If you can introduce yourself, sorry, Mohamad.
Oh, were you not able to hear me?
No, I can hear you just fine.
Okay, so my name is Mohamad Junaid. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology at Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. I am a Kashmiri, and my research has been on Kashmir. I have spent years researching Kashmir. My focus has been military occupation and the history of the Tehreek movement in Kashmir.
Great, thank you so much. And then Faysal, if you can introduce yourself, please.
My name is Faysal, and I'm a child of Tehreek, as Junaid pointed out. I was born in the 90s. I started blogging when I was 13, and then I became a journalist. Currently, I'm working in Istanbul, and I'm also a student doing my master's in international relations.
Great, thank you so much. The topic of this webinar is quite a serious one, how to survive in the world's most militarized zone and the daily life under occupation. Currently, one could say that Kashmir is now under its 59th day of occupation, but it's also been 30 years of occupation. Junaid, I would like for you, if you can, to just give a brief overview of the very brief, because it's not brief, but the brief overview of the very complex history when we're talking about occupation for those who have absolutely no idea what's even happening in Kashmir, just to paint a picture there.
Yes, I think the most important thing is that despite the fact that a lot of people know about what has been happening in Kashmir, it's the question of how to frame this history that I'm interested in. My work has primarily been about how Kashmiris understand their own past. So I'll begin with 1931, when Kashmiris rose for the first time, demanding equality, justice, democratic rights from the pre-1947 Dogra regime. Their demand was that they are equal like every other community in Kashmir, and they should be given equal rights. In 1947, there was a possibility of freedom and independence for Kashmir, but the partition of South Asia and the hasty retreat of the British from the subcontinent meant that Kashmir became engulfed in kind of like an imperial contest between India and Pakistan, where India sent its troops, which Kashmiris see as an invasion, and the beginning of the occupation of Kashmir. This process continued till 1987, when like the Kashmiris grew tired of an election system which basically did not represent Kashmiris well, which basically meant that local collaborators, who Kashmiris call collaborators, had started to represent Indian interests in Kashmir rather than representing Indian Kashmiri interests, and which led to the mass uprising for independence in late 1989, early 1990. In response to which, India sent close to 350,000 soldiers, adding on to the already existing 250,000 soldiers that were present in the region, giving them powers like Armed Force Special Powers Act, which gave Indian soldiers immunity from civil prosecution for human rights abuses. And they used these privileges to the fullest. And this process continues into the present. And in the process, India has used the rhetoric of Islamic terrorism, of counterinsurgency war, to inflict a huge number of deaths and destruction in Kashmir. Close to 90,000 people have been killed in this incessant war. Since then, thousands are disappeared. Many of them probably are ended up in mass graves that were discovered along the line of control. And there are reports of rapes, of abuses against women that have been reported by human rights activists in Kashmir, but do not get much media attention. So yeah, it's a long, complex history, but also a simple history. One could think of this as a continuation of a process that started in 1947, and it's continuous intensification.
I want to just go back to something that you just said, which is that one could see this as a long, complex process, but it's simple as well. And yet, to outsiders, for those who have no idea of the history between India and Kashmir, it just seems like the past 59 days, right? The article was revoked and then the occupation happened, where in reality, this occupation has been going on for quite some time. Can you just dive into the complex but simple narrative? Because on one hand, in the last webinar, we talked about how India is able to really paint this as some, as an issue, as you brought up, in terms of Islamophobia and Islamic extremism. Can you dive into that just a little bit, please?
Yes, the story that India likes to tell the international community is that Kashmiris cannot be given freedom because they are Muslims. And this started way back in 1947 when local Kashmiri rebels were demanding freedom. They took up arms against this oppressive Dogra regime. And the Indian narrative was that it was the Islamists who were trying to take over Kashmir. The fact is that Kashmir is a Muslim majority region. Most people practice their religion, just like Hindus practice their religion and other communities practice their own religion. But when the Kashmiri Muslims demand their rights, these rights are couched as if they are like some kind of demands for superior rights. All they're demanding is equality. They're not saying that we want freedom because we're special. They're saying that we want freedom because we're just like everybody else. And so Indian government has used this fact of Kashmiris being majority Muslim as a way to discredit them. And of course, it fits into this larger global narrative of Islamophobia, which got intensified in the aftermath of 9/11. So, for instance, when Modi came to the United Nations General Assembly, the coded language that he used was of Islamic extremism and terrorism, by which he meant that any demands for equality or rights that Muslim Kashmiris are demanding should be simply seen in this binary of Islam versus the rest. So he's building kind of like this international solidarity um, against any Muslim in South Asia, be those Muslims in Assam, be those Muslim minorities in India, be that Pakistan, which also gets kind of coded in that framework, and of course Kashmiris as like somehow being aggressive, being like in their demands.
I think this is a really, really good point to bring up, how the language that Modi uses really is further marginalizing Kashmiris and Muslims. Because this is not just an attack on Muslims in Kashmir, this is an attack on Muslims in India, in Assam, in so many different places within India that Modi is doing. Faisal, I want to turn to you. The topic of this webinar is daily life under occupation. Can you paint a picture? And so many of us that are listening to this webinar, that will listen to this webinar, even for myself, we don't have the experience at all as to what daily life under occupation looks like. Can you describe what that can be like or is like for Kashmiris right now, and all of the knock-on effects, all of the impacts that occupation has, not only just on education, but on business, on families, and go from there?
To contemporize Charles Dickens, these are the best of times and these are the worst of times. So occupation, like living under occupation, when you see it from the outside, it's like, how did I survive this? And when you're there, it's like you kind of normalize it, because if you don't normalize it, your survival instincts won't kick in. That survival mode that has been there since generations. So I think if for me as a Kashmiri who was born and who grew up there, if there was no conflict and there was no occupation, I don't think I would be the person I am today, because occupation has shaped mine and a lot of other people who are from my generation, their identity. Even from Junaid's generation, I don't think he's that older than me, but also his peers as well. I had written this a long time back when I started blogging, that I was born in a conflict. I was born in a curfew in a snowstorm. I tried to play football. I tried to play football, but I got caught in barbed wires and tried to run for medals, but I had to run for my life. So it was kind of an idea, like when we used to play cricket on these in these large cricket open fields, which were being invaded by this martyrs graveyard slowly and slowly in Idgah, where we used to go and play cricket. Or in these by lanes of downtown Srinagar, where I grew up. We used to play cricket or play football or whatever games we used. And then there used to be this sudden scream, the military is coming. And then this survival mode would kick in and we would just jump over like 10 feet walls. And even like being a 8-year-old, you were trained to like, okay, this is the way you step on this wall and this is the way you push yourself and you go on. And how do you jump? So these were techniques that we kind of learned ourselves, and the environment around us conditioned us. We could tell how a military would respond by their way of walking and by the way of their running. So like I grew up next to a military camp. I remember when I was little, these balls would go inside that camp and they would never return it. And I remember I had promised myself that one day when this camp will go, I'll play cricket inside it. So luckily, it happened before the occupation in the entire Kashmir ended. It was 2 years ago, after 4 months of long curfew. We had no internet. So I used to survive by playing volleyball and football and cricket with these kids in my neighborhood. And so the military suddenly one fine day said, we will leave, because the occupation is so entrenched in Srinagar that you don't need physical spaces to make the occupation visible by these bunkers and military camps. So because they have these huge cantonments in around Srinagar where they can instantly reach any part of Srinagar in 5-10 minutes. So they left one fine day. The structures was practically in ruins. So they had demolished the wall. So I went inside. I called all the kids in my neighborhood, said, let's go and play cricket. So when I held my bat, I remember that promise I had made to my like 8-year-old self that when this will go, I'll start playing cricket. So I went there, I held my bat, and I played, and that was the best moment in my life. It was the closest that I have been to feel that freedom in my heart, in my soul, and I cherish that moment. And incidentally, I recorded it on phone. If I grow up like older, because Kashmiris tend to have very low lifespans. I hope not. I hope we get to see the day our ancestors and we envision. I'll show it to my friends, my kids, the next generation, that this is what I did when that moment happened, and that's when I realized that it is possible.
That's so incredibly powerful, Faisal. And I think what people need to recognize and understand is that Kashmiris and young Kashmiris now, they do not know a life without occupation. The society that they
But
have.
but they don't know a life without occupation, but they live a life without occupation in their dreams and hopes. I don't think there's a single Kashmiri who I know who does not envision a life without occupation. It's our it's our only purpose in life is to live free. When I told myself that I have to leave Kashmir, even when I'm here, I keep thinking of it. There's this Kashmiri American poet who's basically our poet of liberation. He says, each night put Kashmir in your dreams, and that's what we all do. So we have seen how it feels like. We have seen it in our dreams and hopes, and it's there. We know how it's going to be, but it's not there yet. You know, we're working towards that. That's the whole idea.
Can you speak towards, Faisal, as a follow-up question, the impunity, the absolute lack of accountability that the Indian military has in what they do in Kashmir?
I have a lot of stories because I want to be a storyteller. That's my goal. So I remember this time in school, a military crackdown happened, and they took our principal. They basically took him to prison, maybe for extortion and something like that. And I pointed a finger to the military, and this guy in my school, I don't remember his name, he told me never point a finger towards a military person. And that was in 1997. I was very little. Until 2008, when we had the mass uprising, I never dared to put a finger, point towards a military personnel. That's how intrinsic the fear, the culture of impunity is. It's not like they kill you and you can't do anything. It's that whole environment that is conditioned to tell you that no matter what you do, it's basically the occupation makes you very fatalistic. It makes you think that everything that you do is not worth it because they have all the power and they can do whatever they want to do and they can get away with it. They can just walk in your house and decor and tell you to basically leave, and then you can't do anything because they have the power, because the power is in their hands with guns. The power is in their hands with law. The power is in the hand of a state that backs them. The power is in their inherent colonization of a land. The power is in of their power lies in our disenfranchisement of us as a human being. It is in their media, which continues to portray us as continues to portray us as demons and dehumanizes us on a daily basis. So all those constructs that there is, they derive that power. Occupation derives that power from that. And Kashmiris are not just fighting an army; they're just fighting an entire state. Not just the state, but it's also structures that are so deeply entrenched in our society. It's probably the world's most dirtiest and most entrenched occupation in its history. I mean, you have 60 days of a siege, and they say everything is normal because they have normalized it for the last 30 years now. Like, as Aga Shahid Ali says, they make a desolation and call it peace, and that's what peace is for them.
I want to ask you both another round of questions, but then also remind everybody we have a question that's come through that I'll ask at the end. But if you do have questions, please type them in the Q&A box and we will get to them at the end. Junaid, you've done research on militarization. And I want to ask you, with your research in mind, how has it shaped Kashmiri political subjectives from your findings?
Well, as you can hear from Faisal's anecdote as well, a lot of us, a lot of younger people who have not seen any normal except the abnormality of the occupation, we have grown up with dreaming that there is light at the end of the day, that we believe in a future of freedom and freedom from occupation. And most Kashmiris interact with themselves, who they are and what Kashmir is, in primarily two ways. One is um, through their everyday interactions with the state, which are, of course, undergirded by violence. Like you cannot, the state in Kashmir is a repressive state. State in Kashmir is the state that wants to control you, control your voice. It wants to turn your body into like an object that it can inflict pain upon. So every interaction, be that on the street, be that in the school, be that in your own home, is laden with fear, is laden with anxiety. So that's one way in which Kashmiris have internalized an understanding of state as necessarily an enemy, and which is of course borne by facts, because that's how most Kashmiris interact with the state. Second, they look at their own history. They try to find themselves, try to understand where are they placed in relationship to other societies. How do they see themselves in relationship to their previous generations? I mean, I told you at the beginning that the framing is important. And this framing is not simply a political convenience. The framing is the Kashmiri framing, that Kashmiris understand their history as a history of suffering, as a history where one foreign ruler after another foreign ruler has come and taken away our freedoms. And so in a way, you could say that the political subjectivity of Kashmiris is shaped by these violent interactions with the state and their own desire to locate themselves in the history of struggle and resistance. And Kashmiris primarily see themselves as a population that is resisting. Kashmiris do not see themselves as ever dominating anyone, or they see themselves as like one among this larger group of communities around the world, nations around the world, who are facing similar questions. The Palestinians, people in other places where similar occupations are taking place.
As a follow-up to what you've just said, I mean, this you said, and I'm just remembering this off the cuff. You said that Kashmiris do not see themselves as ever being in power over anybody else, and that this daily life under occupation is something that becomes embedded within the narrative. I'm paraphrasing here. And you also brought up the Palestinian context as well. This everyday living under this occupation, I mean, has changed almost the DNA of Kashmiris that are living in the valley. And when we're talking about the subjectivity, it's, I don't know, I find myself struggling with the understanding of how deep occupation really is embedded within Kashmiris, on a day-to-day level. And I say this as an Indian Brahmin that is very aware of the Hindu right wing, Hindu nationalism, and everything that has done up until this point. So I guess I'm having an existential crisis in formulating this follow-up question to you. But can you expand on that a little bit more?
Well, I think that every society has some kind of a moral understanding of themselves. You know, there's a moral center, how they imagine themselves. I mean, it could be true of every society that they imagine that they're not oppressing anyone. But in the case of Kashmiris, they strongly believe that they have never been in a position of power over others. That even in cases when there have been other minorities, even those minorities have typically been in a position of power over the larger Kashmiri Muslims, and which makes most Kashmiris ask, why is it happening to us? You know, when we don't deserve to be occupied. I mean, uh, occupation is not something external to Kashmir. It's not like out there in our public spaces alone. I mean, of course, I've written about like how the infrastructure of occupation can, kind of shapes our everyday activities in Kashmir, in simple things like walking freely. But it's also embedded in our self-consciousness now that everything from how we wake up in the morning to how we spend our nights and days is shaped by occupation as a real fact. It is not, when I talk about occupation, I'm not simply talking about legal occupation under international law. I'm talking about occupation with all of its materiality, all of the power that it has over our life. Its power to determine whether we can live or whether we can die. We must die. Its power to determine whether our children can go to school or whether they should just stay home. Its power to determine, whether how our economy should function, whether there will be transportation today, whether I will be able to go to see the doctor today or get medicine today. Every little detail of our lives is shaped by this. Like there is no Kashmiri who does not make everyday decisions, little mundane decisions, keeping in view that there is an occupation around. So that's what this occupation has done to us.
Thank you for expanding on that. Faysal, last question to you before we get into the questions from the audience. We've talked about the kinds of things that military occupation does to Kashmiris. How do Kashmiris resist? Is there a space for resistance, and what are those actual spaces for resistance? And can you, if there are spaces for resistance, can you expand upon what they look like? Is it online activism? Is it street protest? Is it the Kashmiri diaspora outside of Kashmir itself?
Okay, going back to Agha Shahid Ali again, because I have been reading him a lot, so derive a little inspiration from him. So he went to Barcelona once, and this is how the poem starts. So this woman at the counter asks him, "Are you carrying anything dangerous?" And he says, "Just my heart." So in Kashmir, people who resist the occupation is not just by streets; it's also mental, it's also spiritual, as well as it's very inherent in everything you do. Like I was speaking to my mom a couple of weeks ago. She was here a month back. I asked her, do you walk in Kashmir, in Srinagar, where I'm from? Do you walk like you used to in Istanbul? I got her like these Nikes after a long time, and she was very happy about it. So I asked her, like, do you walk in your Nikes in Kashmir every day? So it's a very small, mundane thing, as Junaid said. So she said, no, I can't walk because the military is everywhere. So the only thing I do is I just go through my videos that I took while I was walking in Istanbul, just reminiscent of what could have been with these new Nikes if everything was fine in Kashmir. So resistance has there's a lot of spaces in Kashmir, but the thing is that the occupation takes over every damn thing. You do street protests in 2008. We had million-man marches before Tahrir happened. We had people organizing protests through social media. The state took over the streets. The state is taking over social media. They're impersonating Kashmiris and trying to say that, okay, these are Kashmiri voices when they are not. And that is that. But also, it's also, when you say you're a Kashmiri, with all that structures of violence, with all the narratives that are being played out by the state and its media. When you say you're a Kashmiri, you're making a political statement because you're denying that India has taken over identity. Because those who say they are Kashmiris, they don't identify themselves as Indians necessarily. So the resistance is from there. If you say you're a Kashmiri, you resist in your existence. First of all, you resist when you wear your when you wear your ethnic or cultural um, apparel, when you when you eat Kashmiri food, or when you talk in Kashmiri, because all of these things have gone through us all. When you listen to Kashmiri music, when you go through these poets that have written about Kashmir, when you read history, when you teach Kashmiri kids, when you do these webinar sessions, when you tweet on Twitter, when you post on Facebook, when you make an Instagram story, when you post something on Snapchat about Kashmir. So everything, the state has tried to take over of these Kashmiris. But there's also this resistance that is happening everywhere on all surfaces, because resistance is not just through guns, and it's not just through protests and so on. It's also all these collective resistance that shape our identity, and we keep fighting. Like if if as long as you say that you're a Kashmiri and you understand the context, you know the history, uh, it's inside you. As I said, when Aga Shahid said that the most dangerous thing about him was his heart, and also the fact that we have been fighting for the last 500 years. This is like a generational struggle that has been going on, like just like the Catalans in Spain, and we have our own elements of resistance. We have the slogans that Kashmiris used when the first Mughal occupation happened. They are being used against India now. So there is this 500 years of occupation. The same slogans are being used against different types and different dynamics of the occupation. So as long as we exist as Kashmiris, as long as we profess and we see ourselves as Kashmiris, we will continue resisting, because our existence, which the Indian state does not want, is in itself resistance to that. And we are trying to humanize our own spaces. We're trying to sing, we're trying to write poetry, we're trying to write books, we're trying to get into academia, we're writing stories about all these mundane things, but they're also, for me, a part of an external and collective effort to fight an occupation, because occupation doesn't just come for your homes and streets. It comes for your mind. It wants to make occupation a part of your life. It wants to take over all your identity that you have. And when you resist that through these little things, you are fighting an occupation. That is resistance for me as a Kashmiri.
Thank you so much for expanding on that. I want to, in interest of time as well, I want to get to the questions that you all have asked, and thank you so much for your patience, and we want to make sure that we get to all of your questions. So if you still have them, please type them in the next 3 minutes. We'll start with the first one, which is, how does the Indian media play a role in furthering the Islamophobic narrative? How are journalists and newspapers treated when they attempt to center Kashmiri voices? And this is from Alina. I apologize if I'm pronouncing your name incorrectly. Junaid, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the rise of the right wing in India wouldn't have been possible if its voice hadn't been amplified by the Indian media so much. I mean, before starting my research on Kashmir, I actually worked on Indian nationalism itself. And I was curious to ask, why is it that Indian nationalism simultaneously centers Kashmir, while at the same time, completely effaces Kashmiri voices? And this was a time when, much of this Hindu nationalist narrative was present in Hindi language media and local media. But over the last, I would say at least around 10 years, the English language media, some of the most sophisticated voices in India have adopted the narrative of Hindu nationalism. You can see them speaking with authority, over on Kashmir, and using their own nationalist framework, which is built on dehumanization of Kashmiris, as Faisal said, dehumanization of Kashmiris, um, basically denying them fundamental humanity, uh, seeing their voices as necessarily anti-Indian. You know, to seek independence or freedom is not to be anti-Indian. You know, one could even argue that Kashmiris might be like using the framework of India's own freedom struggle from its colonial powers to argue against the current Indian imperial aggressions in Kashmir. Um, so the Indian media has kind of adopted the Hindu right-wing narrative hook, line, and sinker. And this has had, of course, dramatic consequences for Kashmir, because for the first time, what I'm seeing is that the Indian society in general, not only those who are trained in RSS shakhas, who are ideologically trained to see Muslims as enemies, but also like young liberal Indians who go to colleges in Delhi, you know, where they are taught liberalism, how they have developed this apathetic attitude towards Kashmiris. Uh, they would much rather deny that it is happening. They would much rather not see. They would try to unsee all of this. And even if they are forced to talk about it, they would tell us, and this is what they do, they tell us, why don't you accept the reality of the India, of its occupation? And why are you even struggling? Like fundamental questions that are not, that they wouldn't ask themselves if they were in a position as we are in. So there is, I would say, there is a definite hard wiring of the Indian consciousness that has happened through a lot of ideological training and through a lot of you know, the work that media has done in amplifying this the agenda.
Thank you so much. I think this is the next question is a really good follow-up to this, and it comes from John. So Faisal, this is to you. Most NRI Indians are in support of the occupation. Most Indians too are in support. Dehumanization has been normalized. Can you comment on how important it is for other social justice movements to be aware of this? For most of the world, India is yoga and Bollywood.
For most of Indians, Kashmir is Kashmir ki kali, and fair-skinned beauties and handsome guys, and you know, we have to come there. Article 3. There was a song that there were albums out on the same day when its Article 370 was revoked, which basically said Article 370 has been taken. We'll go to Kashmir and find ourselves a Kashmiri wife. I mean, this is the whole film thing that have conditioned Indians to see Kashmir. It's a very new colonial, oriental lens that Indians have seen Kashmir. And the irony is that most NRIs, non-resident Indians who go to the United States and have the best of life and diversity, enjoy the best of diversity, have rights to speak whatever they want to. They want to silence Kashmiri voices. It's kind of it's an irony, but the thing is that Modi also generates a lot of power from his NRI people, because he tries to project this whole strongman attitude, and he says that Hindus. It's also a fascist mentality where you say you create this revisionist history where you claim to be these victims from hundreds of years, and now it's our time to, you know, give it back to the Muslims, because that's the narrative that has been played by the BJP. RSS basically since 1925. The whole Aryan cultural nationalism and all that things. Mussolini, incidentally, he had a similar conditional fascism where the attitude was to create this "I don't give a damn" attitude, where these fascists would go down on the streets and beat people up, and nobody would care because "I don't give a damn" was the motto of the fascists. So they had conditioned the society to not give a damn, and social media has amplified that, because you see, it's not just Kashmir which sees India as an occupation, but it's also Indians who are being the brunt of this Hindutva government, who are being lynched, and these videos are being disseminated on WhatsApp. First, it's like terrible to see how people are being lynched, but what makes a person take that video in the first place of lynching? It's to show that whole strongman mentality. Like, look, we will get away with it. We'll show this video, and so those videos have normalized violence against India's own marginalized communities. And Kashmir is like this, the center of Hindutva's national project, because it's also this. There was this article in Wire which basically said the Hindutva fantasy of subjugating Pakistan is being realized by subjugating Kashmiris. So since they, and the way that Indian media has, called Kashmiris Pakistanis, and try to dehumanize them and demonize them with the whole journalism of that genocide, basically, in when that Pulwama attack happened, which killed 40 plus Indian soldiers in Kashmir. This famous anchor in India, Arnab Goswami, who, if incidentally existed in Rwanda, would have been persecuted for war crimes. He basically said, "I'm okay with collateral damage in Kashmir," and he has no accountability. So there are these other anchors who say like, okay, if his bigotry is getting unchallenged, ours will too. So they try to outdo each other in like who's more bigoted than me. And NRIs also watch this kind of stuff. Like I recently spoke to an NRI and I asked her like, why do you support Modi? And her answer was, if not Modi, then who else? And this is that whole strongman attitude where you derive power of your ethnicity and the whole nationalism that is exported to these foreign shores where they enjoy diversity at the same time they want to ghettoize the other minorities.
Yes.
Coming to that social justice movement, I think it's actually very late for social justice movements, and I think now, if not now, then never. Again, Aga Shahid Ali says, "Come before I'm killed, my voice cancelled." So I think it's important for Kashmiris as well as social justice movements to collaborate with each other, because if like this with Stand with Kashmir and you guys, it's very important, and the collaboration should be like on equivalence. Like the Black Lives Matter, we must participate in their social justice movement, and they will in turn support ours, because solidarity is not conditional. It's a two-way street, and it has to be like that. And injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. So if you stand up for one marginalized group and one occupied society, you must stand up for everyone.
Absolutely.
That's the essence of humanity and resistance, basically.
Yes. And I want to just add that, in my personal view, that the Indians that are silent in this are dangerous, because they are actively promoting violence against. They're actively promoting violence against marginalized populations within India itself. So, we need to call out every single time a Priyanka Chopra, tweets Jai Hind. We need to call that out 100%, because that is not okay. We have 4 questions still left. So I'm going to just, because otherwise we're going to be here for a good hour and a half.
Yeah, we'll probably resolve Kashmir by the end of it.
One more. So I want to just go to Wasim's question, which is, why is it that an average Indian people is fine with curfew, sheer unjust blockage of communication, and totally shut down local journalism? Is that Islamophobia, or are they just fine with it as long as it's not happening to them? We see people reacting to one national language issue more than the issue created by the BJP government. Wasim, that's like 3 questions in one. But Junaid, I'm going to turn that one over to you.
Sure. So, I have been thinking about how Kashmiris, who are just like 8 to 10 million of us, and if you count worldwide, there are not more than 13 million Kashmiris, compared to 1.2 billion Indians. India has used this massive kind of differential of population as a weapon against us. I call it weaponizing noise. Every time a Kashmiri speaks, there are like 100 Indians who are like ready to offer counter arguments. These are not arguments. These are basically ways to discredit, ways to shut you down, ways to use whataboutery to discredit your suffering and pain, ways in which you will be silenced and invisibilized. They become hyperactive, for instance, if there is any mention of Kashmir in international media or by anyone, with a recognized voice internationally. I think they use noise strategically here. And what it does, it cultivates an attitude which dehumanizes Kashmiris. There's a single Kashmiri voice and it's being basically silenced by 100 different Indian voices. Of course, there will be no education of your own community or any global community. If what India has done since 1947 in Kashmir was done by China, not that China is any good, I don't want to say that, but if they had done something like that to a people and had prevented international media from raising those questions, there would be an uproar. Like, I'm surprised, for instance, that in Hong Kong, there was a first protester who was shot by the local police there, and it raised hue and cry across the board. In Kashmir, since 2016, there are hundreds of people who've been, deliberately blinded, not to mention shot, maimed, disappeared and incarcerated in the most brutal way possible. Yet it has not shaken any conscience. I think the reason is, of course, one, the entrenched Islamophobia in both international as well as Indian journalism, which of course, Indian state benefits from that. And second, that India has used its overwhelming, voice and amplified voice as a way to shut down Kashmiris, denying us a voice. Like one quick example, like if you, Faisal mentioned these Indian, media personnel who whenever they invite Kashmiris or any Muslim for that matter, unless these Muslims are like, support the Indian agenda in Kashmir, they are berated, they are disrespected, they're shouted down in a way which kind of produces some kind of like a frisson among the Indian audience. They love it when their anchors are shutting down Kashmiris, that they get some kind of a pleasure out of Kashmiri being shown his or her place. So yes, within that larger ecosystem, I think that of course it's not possible for Kashmiri voices to be heard and their humanity to be recognized.
Two more questions, and this one is from someone who is attending anonymously. What role are the Ambanis playing in the abolishment of Section 370? Is the Indian business community seeing Kashmir as a place for resource exploitation? Faisal, do you want to take this one?
I think Junaid is much better.
Go ahead.
Well, I think that, of course, yes. I mean, you have to look at the rise of BJP and the Hindu right wing in India is not simply a result of ideological training. It's backed by a lot of corporate money. Be it Adani's, be it Ambani's, they have financed many of these corporate news channels that openly propagate the BJP's talking points. I mean, if you look after the reading down and the abrogation of 3335A, there has been talk about a new corporate conference happening in Srinagar in October. It would have happened if like things hadn't gone unexpectedly for India. But they were trying to say, well, we're going to buy huge tracts of land. And of course, there's a lot of land that is under state control, not just like in private possession of people, but under state control, which these corporates have been eyeing for a very long time. I mean, look, there is, of course, resource extraction that's going to happen. One of the things that the conflict was beneficial for was that it protected to some degree Kashmiri resources, because these corporates were uncertain whether they could invest in Kashmir or not. And although they could, if they wanted to, they could, because they could still have 99-year leases, which are equivalent to actually owning land. But now what they want is like a settler colonial framework where local populations would be ghettoized, will be put in these spaces that will be kind of ruled under a colonial regime, while the rest of the area would be opened up for corporates to buy up, to develop, to creating a secondary population which will be backed by Indian military and ruled under the same laws as India is. So it's an ecological disaster. So it's not about resource extraction only, it's about the ecological disaster that India is envisioning in Kashmir, because Kashmiri ecology is extremely fragile. Like when I think about Kashmiris and Kashmir, it's a relationship that goes back millennia. I mean, our ancestors cultivated this land in the most tender way possible, keeping a degree of balance between what the nature had given us and how we used it in a way without destroying it. But of course, the Indian corporates have no such organic links to this region. They're gonna use it to multiply their profits, and I mean, of course, that's how capitalism works. They will turn every last bit of leaves and roots and our bones and monetize it. That's what they want to do.
Last question to you, Faisal. This is from Kushi. I'm pretty sure that I am losing touch with reality. I write to keep myself sane. It is day 60 now. It's 12 a.m. where I live, now 12:20. How do we truly help our home? Is there an agenda we should follow? What comes first?
Again, Marga Ali. I've been reading him a lot these days, keeps me sane. He says in one of his poems, he says, humankind can bear everything. So what we are going through now, an assault on our identity and our existence, we will bear it too. I mean, we are survivors. I mean, that's what we are. We have survived occupations, and we have survived crackdowns and massacres and killings and murders and days without water, days without electricity, snowfall, and all those crazy things. But but we always understand that we have to continue to live as we want on our own terms. As a Kashmiri who is outside in a diaspora, it's a very frustrating time. To be honest, I was telling my friends that I find rest in a war zone. If I was home, I would be more at rest than being outside where I am so restless. It's a thing. I don't know how to say. In Kashmiri, we say "Chairishu thairpedi kararyon," which is an ancient proverb which means a sparrow only feels at rest when it's on its own branch and inside its own nest. So yeah, I mean, it's frustrating. There's always that much anxiety and restlessness. I mean, I talk to my family in my dreams now because I haven't been able to speak to them for like the last 2 weeks. So I have conversations with them. I'm pretty sure it's for a lot of us, because we take a pain more because we feel it, because we have personalized it. Being outside, you can do a lot of things. First of all, you should talk to people, your friends, about how you feel. You should share your experiences, because if you isolate yourself, it will only make it worse. You need to create a community of your own where you can go and share your pain and anxiety too. Second, you should, if you're working, you should focus on your profession and improve your skills, because they are going to come in handy someday or even today. And if you find any networks of solidarity with Black Lives Matter, Palestinian societies, Indian societies which are for solidarity with Kashmir, or any society that works for people or works for any marginalized community, you should participate in them, because that will give you a feeling of home. Uh, and listen to a lot of Kashmiri music and try to cook Kashmiri food. That's the best thing you can do to feel better. And also read and write a lot. And don't stop writing. Whatever you skill you have, keep using that, because that's also a way of resistance. Don't stop fighting. And there's always this thing we always say: Son Vakti, which means our time will come too. So we shall wait for that day. We shall meet by the gates of paradise when the soldiers return, when the soldiers disappear and return our keys. Aga Shahid Ali to end this.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both of you for taking your time. You know, one thing that is always interesting about these webinars is that this you know, we have Kushi that's in a time zone that is at 12 a.m. You know, I'm in Europe. You two are in different locations. We have people in the States that are joining us. This is an issue that hits many, many people in different ways. And so I want to thank you both for taking the time to really share your knowledge with us and share your presence with us on this webinar. Thank you to every single one of the attendees that are, you know, from wherever you have joined us and wherever you are going to be seeing this, whether it's on Facebook, whether it's on YouTube, or another medium. Thank you so much for taking the time to really expand your knowledge in regards to this issue. Silence is not an option. Please make sure that you follow Stand With Kashmir, our really great friends with Stand With Kashmir. They just did an incredible silent vigil in New York this past weekend. And so definitely check out their website. We'll make sure to put the links in the next newsletter that we send out. And then stay tuned for our next webinar, which happens in 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks after that. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you so much, Junaid and Faysal, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Uma. Thank you, Faysal, too.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.